So I recently went through something that I still can't believe actually happened. You know when you move somewhere new, expecting peace, quiet, and maybe a friendly wave from the neighbors. Yeah, that's what I thought too. But what I got instead was a nightmare wearing an orange blazer, a clipboard in one hand, and a camera rolling in the other. And the way it all started, looking back now, it feels like she was waiting for me. The lake was supposed to be my escape. A retirement dream, a place to breathe after decades of grease-stained hands and long days running my own garage. Emily, my daughter, had helped me pick the cabin. She wanted me to finally have a spot where work didn't chase me home. The moving truck had barely turned the corner when I heard footsteps coming up my driveway, sharp, deliberate, like a drill sergeant on parade. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, grease still smudged across my palms, and when I looked up, there she was. Pam Weston, the self-appointed queen of Lakeside. Her posture said it all, chin high, clipboard hugged to her chest like it was a sheriff's badge, and that smile, thin, practiced, not an ounce of warmth behind it. Everyone in this community is required to join the HOA, she declared, like it was the law of the land. Emily, still unpacking boxes by the porch, froze. Her eyes flicked from the woman to me, cautious, sharp. That's always been her way, calm, analytical, not easily rattled. I half-smiled, figuring this was some routine paperwork thing. But then I noticed the phone in Pam's other hand. It wasn't just a phone. She was live streaming. Broadcasting my driveway, my tools, my face to someone. Maybe many someones. That was my first warning sign. I tried to play it cool. "We'll need to review the paperwork first," Emily said firmly, her tone polite but edged. She had that look she gets when she's spotting flaws, steady, piercing, already searching for the catch. Pam's smile flickered. She shoved a thick stack of documents at us, her nails tapping the highlighted sections about mandatory fees, community standards, and lake privileges. I only half heard her pitch because my eyes had drifted to the old weathered sign near the trail. It was half hidden in weeds, the words almost gone with time. But clear enough, lake maintained by state parks. Wait a minute, state park. If the state owned the lake, how could Pam's HOA demand fees for access? I tucked that question away, watching Pam's lips move, her eyes sharp with the kind of certainty only rehearsed confidence can give. "You've already had violations piling up since May, haven't you?" she asked suddenly. Violations? We just moved in. I hadn't even set up my toolbox. How on earth would she know anything about us, let alone violations? That was the second warning sign. Pam's little performance wrapped up with another not-so-subtle threat. Most people find cooperation easier than resistance. She said it with a smile, but I heard the steel in it. Emily was already snapping pictures of the documents, filing away evidence with quiet precision. I didn't know then how important that habit would become. Later, we spread those papers across the kitchen table. Rules about lawn heights, vehicle types allowed in driveways, even restrictions on outdoor activities near the lake. Some of it was absurd, some of it was downright impossible. And the fees, way higher than anything we'd budgeted. But that sign kept flashing in my mind, state parks, public land. None of this was adding up. That night, the unease turned into alarm. Around 9:30, the doorbell camera caught movement at our mailbox. A clipboard clattered to the ground. Hands, deliberate, searching, rifled through our private mail before disappearing into the darkness. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Someone was snooping. Emily replayed it again and again, her face unreadable, but her eyes were fire. One day into this so-called community, and already our mail was being raided. By the weekend, the pressure hit like a hammer. Notices taped everywhere, our mailbox, garage, even under the wipers of my truck. Violations, dozens of them, tools visible from the street. Grass below standard. Grass, we'd been here 3 days. The lawn hadn't even had a chance to grow. And the strangest thing, Pam was live streaming herself doing it. Performing for her invisible audience as she plastered our property with warnings, narrating like she was hosting a show about disciplining newcomers. It wasn't about rules. It was about humiliation. Then came the sabotage. When I checked my truck, I found industrial-grade staples buried in the sidewall of my rear tire. Not an accident, not road debris, intentional damage, deliberate, professional. I've worked on cars my whole life. I know sabotage when I see it. That's when the reality hit me. This wasn't overzealous neighborhood enforcement. This was a campaign, a war dressed up in paperwork and fake authority. And if you're thinking I must have been imagining things, I wish I had been. Because what happened next, what Pam did to my daughter, proved just how far she was willing to go to keep control. Everyone saw the violation papers plastered across my door, but no one asked why they appeared just 3 days after we'd moved in. That silence, that's what bothered me the most. It wasn't just Pam's harassment. It was the way the entire neighborhood seemed to stand back, watching, waiting, as if they'd already chosen a side. Saturday morning should have been quiet. Instead, my driveway looked like a stage set for some twisted reality show. Pam stood there again, clipboard raised, phone angled perfectly as she live-streamed herself tearing into us. She wasn't documenting violations. She was building an audience, a following. Emily came outside, coffee in hand, hair still messy from sleep. She read one of the papers taped to the garage and just shook her head. "This grass violation is impossible," she muttered. "We've only been here 3 days." I wanted to laugh, but then I noticed the neighbors. A man across the street, standing still, pretending to water his lawn while sneaking glances our way. A couple walking their dog who slowed just enough to watch Pam's performance. No one stepped in. No one questioned her. It felt like we had walked into a theater production where everyone knew their lines, except us. By Sunday, things escalated. An email landed in every resident's inbox, subject line, "Lakeside newcomers need community guidance." Pam hadn't just branded us as outsiders, she was framing us as threats to community harmony. She didn't accuse us outright, but the implication was there, dripping off every carefully chosen word. The pressure wasn't just on us. It was designed to isolate us, to make our neighbors suspicious before we had a chance to introduce ourselves. Divide and conquer, suburban style. And then came the tow truck. It circled our block once, twice. By the 4th pass, I was standing in the driveway, arms crossed, staring directly at the driver. He slowed, almost to a crawl, eyes flicking toward my truck, then sped off. The next night, the same truck came back, this time after dark. That's when I realized this wasn't just harassment, it was surveillance. Someone was studying us, testing us, looking for the moment we'd slip up. Emily started keeping records. Every email, every violation notice, every suspicious vehicle. At first, I thought it was just her way of staying organized, of building a case. But the more I watched her, the calm precision of her notes, the way she photographed evidence with timestamps, the way she encrypted her files, the more I realized something. This wasn't the first time my daughter had dealt with intimidation. Tuesday night, we decided to attend one of Pam's so-called community meetings. The flyer had been taped to our door like a summons. Resolution conference, mandatory for all new residents. The wording made it sound official, binding, like court. The community center smelled of dust and disinfectant. Rows of folding chairs faced a table where Pam sat like a judge. Beside her was a man I hadn't seen before. Bald head, lapel pin, papers stacked high in front of him. "This is Alan Harper," Pam announced, "our compliance specialist." The man smiled like he'd just been introduced on national television. "I help communities manage their difficult cases," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. When I asked if he was a lawyer, his answer slid past me like oil. "I handle regulatory matters," he said. "No specifics, no credentials, just jargon." Red flag number 1. Emily's pen scratched quietly against her notebook, every word captured. Alan pulled up a presentation on a screen. Documents, forms, contracts. At first glance, they looked official, until you noticed the details. Letterheads from states we didn't live in. Logos copied and pasted with mismatched fonts. Red flag number 2. Emily raised an eyebrow, jotting faster now. Then came the kicker. Alan handed out papers with QR codes linked to official HOA records. But when Emily scanned one with her phone, the screen lit up with something I'll never forget. Not bank records, not bylaws, a PayPal account, under the name P.W. Weston, Com Community. Pam's name, her personal account. I watched Alan's confident smile flicker as Emily held up her phone, showing him exactly what she'd found. He stammered, shuffled his papers, then muttered something about technical updates that would come later. The neighbors didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't want to. But Emily noticed, and so did I. The meeting devolved into whispers and sideways glances. Alan spread subtle rumors about Emily, hinting she had a questionable work background that might not fit with community values. He didn't accuse outright, just implied, just enough to poison the well. Neighbors shifted their chairs further from us. People who had smiled politely before now avoided eye contact. The isolation was complete. And then Pam announced her newest initiative. For residents struggling to adapt, she said sweetly, we're offering volunteer opportunities to help them learn community standards. Volunteer opportunities, cleaning trails, picking up trash, filing her paperwork. Punishment dressed up as service. Emily leaned toward me, whispering under her breath, "They're not trying to make us fit in, they're trying to break us down." That night the paranoia reached a boiling point, scratching noises at the back fence, shadows moving where no one should be, and when morning came, the water to our cabin was shut off. Not an accident, not a coincidence. Pam wasn't just enforcing rules, she was sending a message: submit or be cut off. But what Pam didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Emily wasn't built to break. She wasn't just my daughter, she was something else entirely. And when Pam finally showed her true hand, when she crossed the line from harassment to open threat, Emily would be ready. Everyone saw Pam's SUV creeping along the lakeside trail, but no one stopped her. No one asked why she was tailing my daughter like a predator stalking its prey. Maybe they were too afraid, or maybe they'd already decided silence was safer than standing against her. It started like any other evening. Emily laced up her sneakers for her jog around the lake. That was her way of shaking off stress, of clearing her head after another long day of violations, rumors, and surveillance. I watched her from the cabin window, her figure disappearing down the path, steady and confident, while the sun bled red over the water. Then I heard it. An engine, low, controlled, following. I looked out again and saw Pam's SUV crawling behind Emily, headlights off, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion, at least from anyone not paying attention. But I knew better. Every time Emily slowed, the SUV slowed. Every time she sped up, the engine hummed louder, closing in. I gripped the window frame so hard my knuckles whitened. Part of me wanted to run out there, to put myself between Pam and my daughter. But something in Emily's stride, steady, deliberate, told me she already knew, and she wasn't afraid. Still, when she came back to the cabin, I could see it written across her face. Something had happened out there, something bigger than violation notices or passive-aggressive emails. She confronted me, Emily said simply, her voice flat, controlled. I set down my coffee. What do you mean, confronted? Emily's eyes locked on mine, unflinching. At the old boat dock, she waited until I was isolated, got out of the SUV, and then, Emily paused, her jaw tightening. She made sure I saw the gun. For a second, my chest went cold. Pam had actually done it. She crossed the line from harassment into violence. What exactly did she say? I asked, my voice low. Emily's lips curled into something halfway between disgust and determination. Her words, I enforce compliance here. Respect comes one way or another, and I'm tired of waiting for you people to understand how things work. The image burned in my mind. Pam's hand resting near the weapon, her eyes sharp with self-righteous fury, her voice dripping with that same fake authority she'd been wielding since day one. It wasn't about fees, or grass, or lake privileges. This was about power, control, fear. And now, she was willing to back it up with a gun. I expected Emily to be shaken, to cry, to break. But instead, she opened her laptop. Calm, precise, like she'd been here before. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, typing out a full incident report, time, location, Pam's exact words. She uploaded the file into encrypted storage, then mirrored it across multiple cloud accounts. I frowned watching her work. "Where'd you learn all this?" I asked quietly. She didn't look up. Standard procedures for documenting criminal behavior. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, but there was something in her tone I hadn't heard before. A weight. A kind of authority I couldn't quite place. This wasn't just my daughter anymore. This was someone else, someone prepared, someone trained. And for the first time since we moved into this nightmare, I realized Pam might have picked the wrong target. That night the threats escalated. A note taped to our door, printed on the same paper stock from the community meeting room. 4 words, Sunday, 5:00 p.m. doc. No signature, no explanation, just a command. The meaning was clear. Pam wanted a final confrontation on her turf, her rules. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin felt like a warning. Every shadow outside looked like a figure waiting to strike. I checked the locks 3 times, then checked again. But Emily, she was calm, almost too calm. She spent an hour on the phone, speaking in a language of codes I didn't understand. Then she looked at me and said, "Sunday will be interesting." Her confidence unsettled me, because confidence like that only comes from knowledge, from preparation, from experience. The next day, the neighbors began gathering, as if Pam had summoned them for a show. Families carried folding chairs. People whispered, pointing toward our cabin. It was as if the entire lakeside had been invited to watch us get broken down once and for all. But Emily wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even pretending anymore. As we walked toward the dock, she carried herself differently. Her back straight, her eyes forward, not like a resident being dragged into a hearing, but like someone who had been waiting for this moment all along. Pam stood in the center, clipboard in hand, her audience gathered around her like disciples before a sermon. She smirked when she saw us, certain she'd already won. But she didn't see Emily's hands, steady, controlled, not trembling even for a second. The neighbors avoided our eyes. They had been conditioned, intimidated, manipulated. Pam had made sure of that, and now they were here to see us humiliated. But what none of them knew, what not even I fully understood, was that Emily was about to flip everything upside down. She began asking questions. Calmly, directly, legal questions Pam couldn't answer. Financial questions Alan couldn't explain. She pressed about bylaws, incorporation documents, fiduciary responsibility. Words sharp as knives, cutting through Pam's carefully crafted illusion. The crowd shifted, murmured. Doubt spread like ripples across the water. Pam's smile cracked, her voice rose. She barked about respecting community values. She ranted about disrespectful newcomers, but every word made her look weaker, smaller. And then her hand went to her jacket. The neighbors gasped. Children pulled close to their parents. Phones lifted into the air, recording every second. Pam pulled the gun, pointed it straight at Emily. "Join this community," she screamed, her voice shrill and breaking, "or find yourself excluded from everything here." For one suspended second, the world went silent. The only sound was the lapping of the lake against the dock. And that's when Emily spoke. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't falter. It rang out across the water, calm and commanding. "Lower your weapon, now." The neighbors froze, Pam froze, and I finally understood who my daughter really was. Everyone heard the click of the safety coming off. That metallic sound, the kind that makes your stomach twist, hung in the air like a storm about to break. Pam's hands shook, but her voice didn't. She was screaming about compliance, about respect, about how we didn't belong here unless we bent to her rules. The neighbors gasped, pulling their children close, some ducking behind folding chairs, others fumbling with their phones, recording. But no one moved to stop her. No one stepped between Pam and my daughter. That silence told me everything I needed to know. For too long, they'd been living under her shadow, afraid, controlled, and now they were frozen, waiting to see if we'd be crushed the same way. Emily didn't flinch. Her voice cut through the chaos, calm and absolute. "Pam Weston, lower your weapon." Pam blinked, thrown off by the authority in Emily's tone. "On whose authority?" she spat, her lips curling in defiance. And that's when Emily moved. Slow, deliberate. She reached into her jacket, not for fear, not for panic, but with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing exactly who you are. The badge glinted in the late afternoon sun. "Sheriff." The air shifted instantly. The neighbors who'd been whispering, avoiding us, suddenly leaned forward, eyes wide. They weren't looking at a newcomer anymore. They were looking at the law. Pam's expression shattered. Confusion, then disbelief, then something close to fear. She stumbled back a step, her grip tightening on the weapon even as her confidence collapsed. "You've been threatening a law enforcement officer," Emily continued, her voice level, her posture steady. "And this is where it ends." Pam's bravado cracked. For weeks, she had ruled with intimidation, with staged performances and falsified paperwork. But now, with one flash of that badge, her kingdom crumbled. I moved quickly, instinct taking over. My hands wrapped around Pam's wrist, twisting the gun away as her finger tightened on the trigger. A shot cracked into the air, echoing across the lake, sending birds scattering from the treeline. Screams rippled through the crowd. The gun clattered to the dock. I pinned her arms behind her back. She thrashed, screaming curses, spitting threats, but it didn't matter. She was finished. Emily stepped forward, her voice ringing with the kind of command that can't be faked. "Pam Weston, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." Phones recorded every word, every second. Neighbors who had once cheered Pam on now documented her downfall. Pam's face twisted, her voice breaking. "I am the law here, I built this community, you can't do this to me." But Emily only looked at her, calm and unshaken. "The law was never yours, Pam, it was just borrowed fear." Those words sank into the crowd. You could see it in their eyes, the dawning realization that everything Pam had built, every violation, every fine, every threat wasn't law. It was a lie. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. Backup. Someone had called as soon as the shot rang out. Within minutes, squad cars pulled up near the lake, lights flashing red and blue against the water. Officers poured in, weapons drawn, but Emily raised a hand, steady, signaling control. "She's disarmed," Emily said, her tone professional. "Secure her weapon, take her into custody." The officers obeyed without hesitation. They recognized her. She wasn't just some sheriff's deputy, they knew her. They respected her. Pam was hauled to her feet, still screaming, still insisting the neighbors would vouch for her. But when she looked around, no one stepped forward. The very people she had manipulated, controlled, humiliated, they just stared at her, their phones raised like mirrors, reflecting her downfall back at her. As Pam was led away, the whispers started. Apologies, regrets. One man admitted quietly, "I knew something was off, but I didn't know how to stop her." Another woman clutched her child and murmured, "She made me pay hundreds for lake access. I thought it was real." The truth was unraveling right there on the dock, thread by thread, as neighbors realized the empire they'd been living under was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Emily wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone, opened a recording, and played Pam's earlier threat. Her voice echoed across the water, "I enforce compliance here. Respect comes one way or another." The neighbors froze. Hearing Pam's words, unedited, undeniable, it was the final nail in the coffin. Alan Harper, the so-called compliance specialist, had been lurking near the edge of the crowd. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a nervous twitch. He fumbled with his papers, stuffing them into his bag, eyes darting for an escape route. But Emily saw him. Her gaze was sharp, unrelenting. "You're next." Alan froze, caught like a deer in headlights. He muttered something about just being a consultant, but the look in Emily's eyes told everyone he wasn't innocent. Not by a long shot. The neighbors started murmuring again, but this time not against us. Against him. Against Pam. Against everything they'd been tricked into believing. As Pam was loaded into the squad car, Emily turned to me. For a moment, she was Sheriff Porter. She was just my daughter again. And yet, I knew I'd never see her the same way. All those nights she'd brushed off questions about her work. All those calm, precise habits, the encrypted files, the detailed reports, it all made sense now. She hadn't just been prepared, she was the law. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel. A hope. But as I looked back at Alan slipping quietly toward the community center, clutching his bag of fraudulent paperwork, I realized one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Everyone thought it ended at the lake. Pam screaming, the badge flashing, the cuffs clicking shut. Neighbors whispering apologies, children peeking from behind their parents, the sheriff's car pulling away with her inside. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But for Emily, it was only the beginning. That night, while the neighborhood exhaled relief, Alan Harper was already moving. I saw him from our cabin window, hurried, clumsy, nothing like the smooth, compliance specialist who'd strutted beside Pam just days earlier. He was stuffing papers into boxes, dragging equipment out of the community center, loading his car like a thief fleeing a crime scene. I almost walked out there, almost confronted him, but Emily's hand on my arm stopped me. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady. "Let him run, he'll leave a trail." And she was right. The next morning, we went to the station. Emily in uniform now, not hiding anymore. The transformation stunned me. She wasn't just my daughter playing sheriff, she was the sheriff. Officers greeted her with respect. Colleagues stopped to shake her hand. It was a world I hadn't seen before, and it hit me hard that she'd been carrying this authority all along, quietly, never needing to boast about it. Alan showed up too, not in cuffs, not fleeing. He walked in like he owned the place, carrying a USB drive and a smirk. "I have evidence," he announced, loud enough for half the station to hear. "Evidence of misconduct by Sheriff Emily Porter." The arrogance in his voice made my stomach churn. He was desperate, trying to flip the script. I wanted to laugh in his face, but Emily just nodded calmly. "Submit it for review," she said. He slid the USB across the desk, like he was handing over a winning lottery ticket. But desperation makes people sloppy. The forensics team plugged it in. Alan leaned back, confident, waiting for the smear campaign to unfold. At first, folders labeled Emily Evidence popped up, screenshots, emails, supposed proof she was unfit for law enforcement. Alan's smirk widened. Then the text dug deeper. Hidden folders, partitioned drives, encrypted files, files Alan thought he'd hidden well. What they uncovered was Emily's misconduct. It was his. Dozens of fraudulent registrations, fake HOA documents, shell companies spread across multiple states, payment records tied to personal accounts. Alan's smirk evaporated as the truth spilled onto the screen. His attempt to frame Emily had backfired into a confession. I'll never forget the look on his face. Shock first, then anger, then the cold sweat of a man realizing he'd just handed the rope for his own noose. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't just about our lakeside community. Alan and Pam had been running schemes across the country, preying on retirement neighborhoods and rural towns where people trusted authority or were too scared to challenge it. Fake HOAs, fake fees, real money. Tens of thousands of dollars, siphoned into personal accounts under the guise of community maintenance. Pam had been the front woman, loud and theatrical. Alan was the architect. And now their empire was unraveling because of one mistake: underestimating Emily. Investigators worked fast. The files showed patterns: template violations, recycled contracts, QR codes leading not to official banks but to PayPal accounts, Venmo transfers, even prepaid cards. Every piece of it screamed fraud. Neighbors who'd stayed silent began to speak up. A man admitted he'd been paying monthly compliance dues for years, but never saw a single improvement in the neighborhood. A woman confessed she'd been told her child couldn't play by the lake unless she contributed to the HOA. Another family had been fined for parking their truck outside, even though no legal restrictions existed. Every story was another nail in Alan's coffin. But he didn't go quietly. He tried to spin it, insisting he was just an advisor. He claimed Pam had misused his templates, that he wasn't responsible for how communities applied his documents. He even accused Emily of planting the hidden files to frame him. Classic projection, the liar accusing others of lying. But the digital fingerprints were undeniable: his accounts, his routing numbers, his trail. By afternoon, federal investigators were already involved. The fraud spanned state lines. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was organized crime. That evening, back at the cabin, Emily pulled up the photo I'd taken weeks earlier of that old, weathered state park sign. She zoomed in on the faint state code etched into the bottom corner. "This," she said, pointing to the number, "is the key." Cross-referenced with state property records, it proved the lake, and every path, dock, and trail was public land. Not Pam's, not Alan's, not any HOA. The irony hit me hard. All their threats, all their rules, all their intimidation had been built on nothing but lies. Emily leaned back, finally allowing herself the smallest smile. They used fear to build control, now we'll use truth to tear it down. But before I could exhale, before I could let relief sink in, my phone buzzed. A text, no name, no signature, just 6 words that froze the blood in my veins. "This isn't over, watch your back." I looked at Emily. Her expression didn't change. She read the message, then locked the phone and set it aside like it was nothing more than a grocery list. But I knew her well enough to see the shift in her eyes. She wasn't surprised, she'd been expecting it. Pam may have been in custody, Alan may have been exposed, but someone else was out there, someone still pulling strings. And we weren't done, not even close. Everyone thought the sirens that took Pam away would mark the end, but endings in real life aren't neat. They unravel slowly, dragging secrets into the light piece by piece, and in our case, the unraveling had only just begun. By Wednesday morning, media vans lined the lakeside road. Antennas stretched into the sky. Reporters with notepads and cameras lingered near the community entrance, waiting for a glimpse of the scandal that was already making headlines. Fake HOA queen arrested at gunpoint splashed across morning broadcasts. But the bigger story hadn't even broken yet. Emily stood at the center of it all, in uniform now, no longer blending into the background. Neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now whispered about her in awe. For weeks, they'd thought she was just the mechanic's daughter, a quiet jogger, a polite newcomer. But now they were learning the truth. She wasn't just my daughter. She was Sheriff Emily Porter. In Pam's downfall, that was only Act 1. State park officials arrived with maps, binders, and a kind of certainty that only comes when the paperwork is on your side. They set up displays right there by the lake, survey records, ownership deeds, jurisdiction documents. Piece by piece, they dismantled Pam's empire. "This lake," one representative said, pointing to a massive laminated map, "is and always has been state property, public land. No private association has authority here." The words rippled through the crowd. Neighbors gasped, Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered curses under their breath as they realized years of fines, fees, and threats had been nothing more than smoke. I watched Pam from a distance as officers escorted her back for questioning. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she still tried to shout over the officials. "They're lying. This is my community. I've kept it safe." But nobody listened. Because the truth was bigger than her lies now. Alan wasn't there that morning. He'd vanished after his little stunt at the station collapsed, but his absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Everyone knew he'd been part of it. Everyone had seen his face beside Pam's at the meetings, whispering authority into her ear. And now, with her empire crumbling, his silence was damning. Emily kept moving through the crowd, calm, deliberate, answering questions, gathering testimonies. Neighbors approached her tentatively, some with shame in their eyes. A man confessed he'd been paying maintenance fees for years, believing he had no choice. A woman admitted she'd warned her children not to play near our cabin, terrified of what Pam had implied about us. Another broke down in tears, realizing the thousands she'd scraped together to avoid violations had been lining Pam's pockets all along. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air. And yet, so did relief. For the first time in years, people felt free to speak, to question, to breathe. The media circled like sharks, capturing every detail. Cameras zoomed in on Emily as she spoke with state officials, her uniform catching the light, her voice calm but strong. She wasn't just representing herself. She was showing the entire community what real authority looked like. Later that afternoon, federal investigators arrived. Their suits were sharp, their questions sharper. They wanted details about Alan's digital files, Pam's PayPal accounts, the shell companies scattered across state lines. It was bigger than anyone had realized. Dozens of communities, maybe more, had been running under similar fraudulent HOAs. Emily handed over the evidence she'd been collecting for weeks, meticulous, time-stamped, encrypted. Her calm precision impressed even the feds. One of them, a tall man with gray at his temples, glanced at her and said quietly, "You built a case stronger than some of our own agents." I could see the pride flicker in her eyes, but she didn't let it linger. She wasn't here for praise. She was here for justice. That night, the community felt different. Lighter somehow. Families gathered by the lake without looking over their shoulders. Kids splashed in the shallows, laughter carrying across the water. It was the sound of freedom, something Pam had stolen and Emily had given back. But even in that peace, shadows lingered. Alan was still out there, and so were the texts. When Emily sat down at the cabin table that evening, she slid her phone across to me. Another message. Just 5 words this time, "You don't know who we are." I swallowed hard, so it's bigger than Pam, bigger than Alan. Emily nodded slowly. Fraud like this doesn't spread across states without a network. Pam and Alan were just players. Someone else is running the game. Her eyes sharpened, her voice low. And they know we're onto them. I stared at her then, realizing something I hadn't before. She wasn't afraid, not even a little. If anything, she was ready. The next morning, she stood in front of the entire neighborhood. Media cameras pointed at her, state officials flanking her. The community gathered in folding chairs and lawn blankets, waiting. She held up one of Pam's violation notices, a flimsy piece of paper that had once carried the weight of fear. Then she tore it in half, the sound ripping through the crowd like thunder. "This," she said, holding the shredded paper high, "was never law, it was never authority, it was fraud. And today it ends." The neighbors erupted, some in applause, some in tears, some in stunned silence. For the first time, they saw Pam's rules for what they were, empty threats. Emily didn't stop there. She promised restitution, real accountability, and a partnership with state parks to ensure the community was never manipulated again. She reminded them that authority wasn't about fear, it was about responsibility, about service, about truth. I looked around at the faces in the crowd. People who had once avoided us now nodded, clapped, leaned forward with hope. The walls Pam had built with fear were crumbling, and Emily was building something new in their place, something real. But as the applause echoed across the water, I couldn't shake one thought. Pam was in custody, Alan was exposed, the neighbors were free. But whoever sent those texts, they weren't finished. And neither was Emily. Everyone thought Pam was the storm, but storms pass. What comes after, the quiet scheming in the shadows, is what really lingers, and that's where Alan thrived. While neighbors celebrated their new freedom, Alan was already planning his counterattack. He couldn't show his face in the community anymore, not after the USB fiasco, but he wasn't gone. Not by a long shot. 2 days after Pam's arrest, he reappeared at the station. Not in cuffs, not apologizing. He walked in like he owned the place, shoulders squared, papers clutched under his arm. "I have evidence," he announced, loud enough for every officer in the lobby to hear. Evidence that Sheriff Porter manipulated this entire situation for her own gain. The audacity nearly knocked the breath out of me. He had the nerve to stroll into her workplace and try to spin his fraud into her corruption. Emily didn't flinch. "Submit it," she said simply. Alan slid a second USB drive across the counter, his smirk barely hiding the sweat gathering at his temple. He thought he'd outsmarted her this time. Thought he'd buried his tracks deeper. But arrogance makes men sloppy. The forensic team loaded it up. More folders labeled Emily evidence. More screenshots, forged documents, doctored videos. At first glance, it looked damning. Until the cracks showed. Metadata didn't match. File dates overlapped in ways that made no sense. A supposed email from 2 months ago had a timestamp from last week. His smoking gun was nothing more than another desperate attempt to rewrite reality. And buried beneath his fakes, like last time, was the real treasure. Financial records, dozens of them. Shell corporations with names that sounded legitimate: Lakeside Management Group, Coastal Community Services, Western HOA Consulting, all registered to addresses that didn't exist. PO boxes, vacant lots, even a shuttered gas station in another state. The scale was staggering. Pam hadn't been a rogue actor. She'd been part of an operation spanning multiple states, bleeding retirees and small towns dry through fake HOAs that charged real money. And Alan, he wasn't just a consultant, he was the architect. One file sealed it, a spreadsheet of routing numbers, transfers, balances, each row a community, each column an account. Millions of dollars had flowed through his network over the years. The room went quiet. Alan's smirk faded into panic as the investigators scrolled line after line of incriminating evidence. Emily leaned forward, her voice steady. "You didn't just scam this neighborhood, Alan. You built a machine, and now it's falling apart." He tried to recover. He muttered about partnerships, about legitimate business practices. He even accused Emily of planting the files again, but his words rang hollow against the hard math staring back from the screen. He wasn't a mastermind anymore. He was a cornered fraud. By evening, federal investigators had him in a conference room, grilling him for hours. I watched through the glass as his confidence crumbled. Sweat soaked his collar. His answers grew short, then frantic, then silent. But even as the walls closed in, one thing about Alan unnerved me. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid of someone else. More than once, he whispered, "You don't understand who you're dealing with." Who was he talking about? Who was above him? The texts kept coming. Short, cold, precise. "This isn't over. She's not ready for what's next. Truth doesn't protect against us." It was clear now. Alan wasn't the top. He was just a piece on the board, and whoever sat at the top wasn't happy that Emily had flipped the table. But Emily, she didn't rattle. Instead, she built. She coordinated with state officials, pulling every shred of evidence into one comprehensive case. She mapped the fraudulent accounts. She cross-referenced Pam's fabricated violations with Alan's templates. She gathered testimonies from every neighbor who had paid, feared, or stayed silent. And then she did something no one expected. She called for a public meeting. Not in the community center Pam had once ruled from, but at the lakeside pavilion under open air where no shadows could hide. She invited every neighbor, every official, every reporter. She wanted the lies destroyed in front of everyone. When I asked her why, she just said, "Because fear survives in silence. We end it with truth, and we do it where everyone can see." The day of the meeting, the air felt electric. Media vans crowded the road again. Neighbors gathered, some nervous, some hopeful. Children clung to their parents. For the first time, people weren't here out of fear of Pam's clipboard. They were here out of hunger for answers, for closure, for justice. Emily stepped up to the center, her uniform crisp, her voice steady. She wasn't reading from a script. She wasn't performing. She was telling the truth. Pam Weston is in custody. Alan Harper is under investigation. But this isn't just about them. This is about a network that has preyed on communities like ours across the country. They built their power on fear, on lies, on your silence. But today, we take it back. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on every word. Reporters scribbled. Cameras rolled. Then Emily held up the laminated map from the State Parks Department, the one proving the lake had always been public. She pointed to the faded code in the corner, the same one I had noticed weeks earlier. "This," she said, "is proof. They never owned the lake. They never owned your freedom." The pavilion erupted in murmurs, then cheers. Neighbors who had once avoided us now clapped, shouted, raised their hands in support. But as Emily's words echoed across the water, I noticed movement near the edge of the crowd. A man in a dark jacket, watching, not clapping, not cheering, just watching, his eyes fixed on Emily with something colder than anger. When I turned back, he was gone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm hadn't hit us yet. Everyone thought the lake meeting was the climax. Emily tearing through Pam's lies, Alan's empire collapsing under digital evidence, neighbors finally breathing free. And in a way, it was. But the real ending didn't come with handcuffs or headlines. It came later, in the quiet, in the rebuilding, in the way people started living again without fear. 6 weeks after Pam's arrest, the lakeside looked like it should have all along. Kids chased each other along the shoreline, splashing in water no one could claim. Families grilled burgers on back decks without worrying about lawn heights or vehicle types. Neighbors waved across fences, no longer suspicious, no longer divided. The fraudulent HOA had collapsed, but what rose in its place was something better. Real community. The restitution came swiftly. Federal court ordered Pam and Alan's assets liquidated. Their cars, their accounts. Even Alan's shell corporations were seized and dismantled. Every dollar stolen through fake compliance dues was returned. Neighbors who had drained savings to appease Pam's clipboard now held checks in their hands. Some cried. Some laughed. Some just shook their heads at the years they'd lost to fear. Pam sat behind bars, still screaming about her authority, still insisting she had been the law. But the world had moved on without her. Her kingdom was dust, her subjects free. Alan faced federal conspiracy charges. The files he'd created to control people became the very chains that bound him. Irony, thick and unrelenting. But even as justice closed in, Emily never relaxed. I'd catch her late at night at the cabin table, scanning through case files, connecting dots across states. Every time she leaned back with that steady look in her eyes, I knew she'd found another community they'd targeted. Another group of families who'd been living under lies just like us. The investigation widened, federal agents uncovering a web of fraudulent HOAs across multiple states. Some small neighborhoods, some retirement villages. Each one bullied, fined, threatened into silence, and each one tied back to Alan's templates. The network was larger than anyone had realized. But now it was crumbling, because one sheriff in one small lakeside town refused to bow to a clipboard and a gun. The media ran with it. Headlines called it the Great HOA Scam. Interviews with neighbors filled primetime news slots. Emily stood in front of cameras more times than I could count, always calm, always steady, always turning the spotlight back to the victims rather than herself. And me, I finally saw her for who she really was. Not just my daughter. Not just the careful, meticulous woman who unpacked boxes with precision, but the sheriff who held her ground when a gun was aimed at her chest. The sheriff who built a case so strong it toppled a multi-state fraud empire. The sheriff who reminded us that real authority doesn't shout, it stands. The cabin felt different now. Quieter, safer. My garage business even picked up, neighbors coming by not just for repairs, but for conversation, for connection. They trusted us now, not just because of what Emily had done, but because we hadn't broken under Pam's pressure. Sometimes at night, I'd sit on the porch and watch the lake, remembering the way Pam's SUV had crawled behind Emily on that trail. Remembering the sound of a gun cocking. Remembering the fear. But then I'd hear children laughing again, neighbors grilling, music drifting across the water. And I knew fear had been replaced. Not by another authority, not by another ruler, but by freedom. The last piece of closure came on a bright morning when state workers arrived with ladders and tools. They pulled down Pam's fake signs one by one, the HOA access-only plaques, the compliance-required warnings, the laminated violation postings she had plastered on trees and fences. The sound of bolts clattering against wood echoed across the water like liberation. Neighbors cheered, some cried. Others filmed, not out of fear this time, but out of relief, wanting to remember the day the lies came down. And in that moment, I understood something. Pam's empire had never been real. It existed only because people believed it did. The clipboard, the violations, the threats. They had weight because silence gave them weight. But once truth spoke, once Emily stood up, it all collapsed. Sometimes authority is nothing more than volume, the loudest voice in the room. But real authority, the kind that lasts, it doesn't need volume, it doesn't need fear, it needs truth. Emily proved that. As the federal investigation spread, more victims came forward. Communities that had suffered in silence now had a name for their pain. Fraud, conspiracy, extortion. And they had hope too, knowing justice was coming. Alan's empire had been built on paper and fear. But now those same papers were evidence, those same fears were testimonies. And the louder he protested his innocence, the clearer his guilt became. In the end, Pam screamed the loudest, but screaming doesn't make you right. It was Emily's calm, steady voice that carried. And when the dust settled, when the neighbors rebuilt, when the fear was gone, I realized something simple. We'd moved here for peace, for quiet, for rest, and somehow we'd found it, but only after walking through a storm. Pam thought she was the law, Alan thought he was the architect, but both forgot the one truth they couldn't erase. Real authority doesn't come from threats. It comes from standing steady when fear tries to own you. That's what Emily did. And that's what saved us all. So maybe the lesson is this: if someone ever demands your obedience, your money, your silence, don't just ask for their rules. Ask for their badge. Ask for the truth. Because in the end, the clipboard, the fines, the threats, they were never the law. Emily was. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.